They are very hard questions for opening up new discussion venues for all of us during the last 2 days. And of course, thank you for our 2 brilliant chairs who made the sessions and discussions run smoothly today. And what we planned to do is in this last bit of our 2 days workshop is to revisit some discussions and questions for your comments, and then finalize the 2 days by introducing our coming workshop. So if you all remember, in the beginning of today's discussion, in the first session, we explored the geographies of Europe and its so-called edges from the research on Finland and Sweden. They explored the invisible whiteness and westernization process in the imaginaries of public, urban, and rural space, as well as the hidden histories of colonization in the often so perceived and promoted peaceful North. Our attendees also questioned whether Northern Europe might be a privileged or particular geography to revisit big concepts such as planetary urbanization. Rightfully, Pirro reminded us how Europeanization process in some of the so-called peripheries of Europe, be it post-socialist, the northern edge of Finland, or the segregated and racialized neighborhoods, all across Central and Northern Europe, might be thought through the politics of memory. He also suggested using Federich's enclosure discussion to have a look at the EU as an enclosure itself. So what we seem to still miss is an archiving and articulation of histories of inequalities, racism across Western and Northern Europe. This also connects to the point that racialization is not a result of neoliberal market reforms, rather a significant pillar of constituting and reproducing neoliberalism. And lastly, in that session, Burcu and Mia suggested to go deeper into the history to detangle the different categorizations and their specialization to identify layers and turning points in these categorizations and their materialization. Defne?
Thank you, Zlem. In the second session in the morning we turned our discussion to another part of the world, where Magdalena invited us to think through a conceptualization of insurgent heritage. She defines the concept as social and cultural justice by showing the limits of critical heritage studies in terms of lacking the voice of the grassroots and the diversity of actions of people. She proposed a triad of memory, place, cultural citizenships, and a place-based ethics of care. Pirro opened up his discussion on the paper by asking us, and I'm quoting here, how can memory be mobilized to integrate the past into the present political moment, but also movement? So heritage becomes an activist tool against exclusion, and culture can be mobilized to lay open systems and structures of oppression. Another point that was raised by a question from one of our attendees was to explore the relationship between care and cultural citizenship in Magdalena's work. Magdalena stressed that this especially applies for women who were excluded from politics and wage labor for a long time, or still are. They constitute themselves as social and political subjects by meeting at homes to organize and strategize preservation and political action. And to continue with the next session then we had today, it was Ben Purvis who came out of his comfort zone and prompted a discussion on the possibilities of a dialogue between natural and social sciences. He discussed the question directly speaking to our workshop theme. So what do we actually mean when we say the canon of urban studies? Because urban studies has been along for quite some time, but it does typically not encompass urban science research. So urban science and urban studies, they seem somewhat to exist and operate in parallel universes with different languages to describe the same phenomena. So there seems to be a need for a dialogue, but at the same time, there are dangers in this dialogue, as we identified, especially if social scientists become relegated to the ranks of mere advisors and the political is excluded. Ben's talk also calls back to the discussion we had yesterday in the first and second sessions with Sujata Patel, who was emphasizing the need of rethinking the definition of urbanization. Must knowledge be inclusive rather than be universal? Tanja Winkler then described Ben's paper as a wake-up call for all of us. As we see vividly in the context of the pandemic, the intellectual political right has co-opted post-structuralism and post-foundationalist discourses to dismiss scientific facts. The left lives through a sobering moment in history. its objective truth questioning language is now co-opted and used to dismiss science. So for many people, their own language and our own language is turned against us to make claims for capitalism, racism, and sexism. This leaves us with a very difficult question to navigate. How do we navigate the space between urban studies and urban science to resist authoritarian and fascist tendencies? Özlem, back to you.
Thank you. And in Jens and Letitia's contribution, they make the case by coding the urban differently by three things. First, with defining a non-Occidentalist West. So what does it mean? And like using the code we used for the call for papers for our workshop series by De Souza Santos, they also define non-Occidentalist West as the vast array of conceptions, theories, arguments that, though produced in the West by recognized intellectual figures, were discarded, marginalized, or ignored. And secondly, they invited us to think with weak or minor theory as a way of refusing to too much and keeping open to change, and reading for different ontological reframing to reproduce the ground of possibility or excavating the possible. And lastly, they pointed out parasites and residues, where Letitia and Jens defined platform urbanism as a form of parasitism. The parasite feeds on the relationship among urban dwellers and between labor and capital. Letitia and Jens turned the commonplace notion of the parasite on its head by reconstituting the practices of corporations behind platform capitalism as parasitic. And Tanya then took our attention and said we are all parasites and hosts at the same time. So what is disobedience? Staying silent to be protected, or putting yourself out and being vulnerable in the competitive neoliberal academia. We need to shake our disciplinary ties and get back to our own disciplines to bring back what we learned. And this intervention took us back to the point raised by Kanishka yesterday. Do we need to revisit our curriculums to be more inclusive and also seeking for alternative pedagogical methods in teaching and learning? What does decolonizing the university curriculum really mean? When we are talking about dislocating urban studies, we also need to address the whiteness in academia in line with the discussion Tanya addressed to the hierarchy and gatekeepers in the academic institutions, including universities and journals, which was also inspired by Miguel's paper and which Defne will share the main points.
Thank you. So Miguel lastly then tracks the academic gaze of the Chicago School in its relationship with race and thereby aims to dislocate urban studies from its institutional roots. So the urban ecology of the Chicago School drew on techniques of whiteness to make sense of the non-white other, leaving whiteness itself unquestioned. Miguel, in contrast, uses a settler colonialist lens and a critical race theory framework to critique the white gaze of Chicago School scholars and on racialized others. These frameworks set out to study the spectrum of white supremacy and its different expressions in space. They are not about studying history or a specific event, but an ongoing structural process. Tanya Winkler then emphasized the importance of reverse engineering the whiteness underlying the field of urban studies. She sees this as part of a practice of decolonizing our brains. Miguel, Tanya, and the participants then took on an important and somewhat painful discussion on allyship, camaraderie, and what it means to do the work of undoing white supremacy in the field and beyond. But honestly, we're still kind of left with the question how to actually challenge the barriers of questioning whiteness. Do we need to reach seniority before we can dare to challenge the very pillars on which the intricate house of urban studies is built upon? We actually think that the papers today were exactly trying to open up the space of daring and going down unknown alleys, as we have used before, making themselves vulnerable while trying to be mindful of practices of care. Thank you. Özlem?
So after this brilliant discussions of the whole 2 days, we would like to share with you the details of our second workshop before closing today. We will have our second workshop titled Places Off the Map, bringing to light the hidden locations of urbanization on the 18th and 19th of March. The second workshop seeks to continue the theoretical conversation started in this workshop by now focusing on empirical examples to prompt a discussion on how a more cosmopolitan and global understanding of the urban can come out. We have again very interesting papers which discusses space of fragmentation, 3 papers on housing the poor by discussing on collective action and urban planning strategies, stigmatization, and how urban poor define preferred places. Some of the papers will push the boundaries of informality discussions and questions informality beyond the global south. We have 4 fantastic discussants, including Anya Lingeren, Abdumalik Simon, Hanna Chervinkova, and Hyunbon Shin. Please check our website for more details, and thanks a lot for being with us during the whole 2 days. Thank you.